homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. If you're new here, thanks for joining me in my kitchen. And if you're not new here, thanks for coming back to my kitchen. Today we are going to talk about corn and most importantly, polenta. And I don't know about you guys, polenta was one of those things where when I started learning about different kinds of grains and branching out from kind of rice, which is what I'd mostly been eating as a grain growing up, I started seeing polenta in the stores, and often when I saw polenta, it was in one of those plastic tubes, kind of like a tube of sausage, and it was shelf stable, and you sliced it up and then fried it in a pan. And I tried that, I think, once or twice, and I wasn't all that wowed by it, but I would sometimes have it in restaurants, you know, as a base underneath a meal, and I was always just kind of like, it's not all that exciting. And then if you've ever made polenta at home, generally it involves pouring polenta cornmeal into hot boiling water or hot boiling broth or sometimes hot milk and stirring it and then cooking it for a really long time. And it's basically kind of the thickness of pancake batter, and it bubbles and spits and makes a huge mess, and it burns on the bottom of the pan in a heartbeat. And then you get done with it and you're like, not all that exciting. So I just kind of tried polenta a couple of times in my 20s and really wasn't all that impressed and just virtually ignored it after that. And then, gosh, probably 10 or more years ago, I bought this book from Carol DeP called The Resilient Gardener. And in it, she's got 5 or 6 different chapters, each one dedicated to a different type of kind of staple. So these are garden staples that if the world, was in another pandemic and you had a lot of these in stock, you could easily survive. So it's a really neat book. Carol is, she's got a PhD in botany, if I remember correctly, and so incredibly well researched. She's done a lot of her own breeding of plants, and it is basically like a deep dive into the different things that she talks about in here. And one of the things that she talks about is corn. And so I read her chapter on corn, and it's pretty much impossible to read that chapter and not get excited about corn. And one of the things that she talked about was polenta. So corn, of course, is a New World crop. It probably originated in Mexico, and it had been bred and traded all over the United States before we were colonized by the Europeans. And generally, there were 2 main varieties of corn. There was flour corns and Flint corns, and I'll put a map up here. One of them was more prevalent in the eastern part of the United States, and one of them was more common in the western and southwestern portion of the United States. Basically, there were Flint corns and flour corns. And a Flint corn, if you were to cut a corn kernel in half and look at it, there's different parts to it. And Flint corns have a much bigger chunk of hard outer coating, and a flour corn is mostly starch and very little of that hard outer coating. And so if you're going to grind something up, a flour corn will be very soft and floury and not have a lot of grit in it. A polenta corn, it has a lot of that outer coating, and so it's a lot more gritty and grainy. And generally, flour corns are better for baking. Flint corns are better for wet applications, so things like polenta. Somewhere in the midst of all of this research, I had also bought some corn from Native Seed Search, which is out of Tucson, and their whole mission is to preserve native varieties of plants that otherwise would go extinct or get crossbred with other things. Corn is a difficult crop to keep pure because it's wind pollinated, and it can pollinate from up to, I believe, to 2 miles away. And so if you want to keep a particular variety of corn isolated, you really have to work hard at it, because pretty much everybody's growing some kind of corn, and then it's very common as a commercial crop. It's what we feed to animals, and so most of our confined feedlot operations for pigs and for cows are all being fed GMO corns and GMO soy. And so it's everywhere. And so it's very hard to keep specific varieties of corn pure. And that's part of what our Native Seed Search is trying to do that. This particular variety of white corn that I had here originated with them. And it was, I'll put the name up on the screen. I believe it was a Hopi corn. And they don't sell it anymore. And my guess is that maybe it wasn't as pure as they had originally anticipated. When I grew it out, I originally grew it out in Colorado, and it was the only variety I grew, and there wasn't anybody growing corn near me. I was interested in it because because it was better at a higher elevation. And where I was in Colorado, I was almost 7,000 feet, and it's very, very, very hard to grow corn at that high of an elevation. And so I was looking for something that was adapted to that, which is why I chose this. And I grew it out, and I had a terrible time growing it because I had problems with earwigs eating the silks of the corn. Who knew? And so I didn't get a whole lot of a crop. I think I grew it out twice, saved seeds from it twice. And then when I moved, I just had a jar of it. And so I started growing it out again. I didn't know anything about corn when I first started doing that. Once I grew it out a third time here, I started really examining it, and it was really obvious that it was a combination of a flint corn, a flower corn, and then a dent corn. And a dent corn is when flower corns and flint corns cross-pollinate, and so you get this indent when the kernel is dry, and so you've got kind of a little bit of both happening there. And dent corn is what's typically grown for feed crops, so that's what's grown all over the United States for animals. And I have a blog post on this. I got examples from the grow out of this of a little bit of everything. So some of it was really clearly flint corn, and you can usually spot flint corn just by looking at the kernels because they tend to be a little more shiny. If you've ever seen pictures of gem corn, that's a flint corn. And so that outer pericarp being thicker reflects the light and gives it a really glossy appearance. It's not flat and matte. And so you can easily kind of eyeball it and see that something is a flint corn rather than flower corn. And then if you cut the kernel in half, it's also pretty obvious. So anyway, long story longer, I took some of the stuff that I had grown out, I ground it. I can't even remember how I ground it. If I'd used a manual grinder, that's probably what I did. And I made some polenta out of it. And I could not stop eating it. It was the best polenta I'd had by far. It was absolutely delicious, and it was nothing like the polentas that I had had in restaurants and in the grocery store. And so I got very excited about corn. And so my pattern now is to alternate years. 1 year I'll grow a flint corn, 1 year I grow a flower corn, 1 year I grow a popcorn. Popcorn is actually a variety of flint corn. It's a type of flint corn. And then 1 year I'll grow some sweet corn. We have really good sweet corn locally, and so I can buy that from my local farmers. And so that's usually what everybody wants to grow. Takes up a lot of room, takes up a lot of water, takes up a lot of energy and nutrients out of the soil. And so most of the time I just buy it from my fellow farmers, and I spend my time growing flint corns and flower corns instead. And then once in a while I'll grow some sweet corn just because it's kind of fun to mix it up. This Hopi corn, you can see there are some blue kernels in here, and they actually, I think they do still sell a blue version of this particular variety. And so there's a little bit of blue showing up in here, and then there's just kind of random genetics. You'll see some kernels that are a little bit more yellow, like there's a yellow one right there. That's probably just random wind cross-pollination. And then the other thing about corn that I learned from Carol is if it's too isolated, it starts to get really inbred and you start losing a lot of vigor. And so there's a really fine line between keeping something pure and inbreeding it to the point where it's really not all that great viability wise. So corn is really tricky. And so I've just resigned myself to, I get what I get. I'm not going to worry about it too much. I won't go into that more now. I'm probably going to do other videos on corn, and so we'll take a deeper dive into that later. But I have this corn that I grew out in 2019, and it's kind of it's a little bit of both. It's mostly flint. There is a little bit of flour in there as well, for sure. And so in this video, I will show you grinding some of this. Even though I have my grain mill set on the coarsest setting, it still comes out pretty soft and pretty floury. And so I dug around in my storage, and I was like, I must have some other flint corns that I'm a little more confident of the genetics on. And so I ended up also grinding some of this red flint corn, and I'll put the name up on the screen. This is actually one of Carol DeP's varieties that she has bred. And so I ground some of that. And then I also have this yellow flint corn, and I believe this is also one of Carol DeP's varieties. You'll see me grind and end up with the results of 3 different varieties of a yellow flint corn, a red flint corn, and then a white flint corn that obviously has some flower corn in it as well. So this is the yellow polenta flint corn that's ground. And polenta is ground from flint. I don't know if I made that obvious. Polenta is a flint corn versus a flower corn. This is got some definite grit to it. Very different from the white version. And then the red one is very similar. This isn't as full because I actually made some of this to eat, but definitely has a lot more grit. You'll notice how old this grain is. My experience with corn is if it's stored in a cool, dry place, it lasts a long time as a whole kernel. Once you grind it, you're releasing all of the oils and it doesn't have a great shelf life, and you should probably store it in your freezer. But in my experience, sitting on a shelf, it does last a very long time. And so this is 2019. This is 2017. So some of these are quite old. It's now 2024. So we're looking at a 7-year-old corn, and perfectly viable and perfectly edible and not rancid. So I'm going to show you how to make polenta in an Instant Pot, because the solution to that hot, bubbly cauldron that you have to stand there and stir or it's going to burn and it's going to splatter everywhere and it's going to take 45 minutes to cook it and it's really going to kind of suck, is to cook it in an Instant Pot. And so I somehow ran across this when I first got my Instant Pot and I was researching how to use it, and it is the solution to cooking polenta. It comes out beautifully. You can flavor it however you want. You can do just a really pure, a little bit of butter, some salt, and just water. You can use broth, and you can add all kinds of herbs and then stir in some cheese at the end if that's what you want to do. So lots and lots of variations on polenta. Absolutely delicious and zero mess, because you're cooking it in your Instant Pot and it doesn't take 45 minutes. You cook it for a total of 8 minutes and then let it natural pressure release for 15. And that's all hands-off cooking time. So really great solution to making homemade polenta. And I highly recommend, if you have the room, play around with some flour corns and some Flint corns. It's really gratifying. The genetics on corn is fascinating, and it's a really great source of carbs. It's a grain that we can grow in our own backyards, unlike wheat, which is a lot more difficult and you need a lot more ground and a lot more equipment to thresh that and to, hull it. Corn is really pretty easy. And so it's a really fun and great homestead staple and a great backyard project. And we'll talk more about how to plant corn and what corn needs in a future video, because this year I'm going to grow a sweet corn. So polenta, let's get started. So this mill is a Nutri-Mill Classic, and I have another mill that's actually a stone ground mill, and it can be used with a motor. It has a motor, or it can be used manually, and it takes absolutely forever. And so when I first started researching mills, I wanted something that was stone ground because it doesn't overheat the grain, and there's some issues with heat and nutrition. But what I found over time is it's worth the slight sacrifice in nutrition to have something that doesn't take literally an hour to grind grain. And so I ended up going with this Nutri-Mill. I really like it. They don't give you a ton of really obvious instruction on grinding corn, but I wanted this on the coarsest setting, and that is both dials all the way to the right. And I have the sound turned way down on this when this is actually running to show you, because it sounds like a jet engine. It is definitely not quiet, but it works great and it works fast. So you want to pound everything, give it a good bump just to knock any flour that's on the surface off the lid. And then you open it up, and here you've got your beautiful ground corn. I did 3 cups in this initial batch, and this probably took a couple of minutes, so it was pretty fast. And I'm now remembering this Vidito corn is more of a flour corn than a Flint corn. This is the ruby gold Flint corn, and you can see how much more coarse that is. Definitely more gritty. And then I also ground some of the red version of this as well. I'm making the polenta, and this recipe, I'll have it linked below. And by the way, guys, if there's a recipe in the video, it is always in the description below. But this particular one, I'm doing a half batch because I had some polenta that was already ground and I wanted to get dinner on the table, and so I was using that up. And so this is chicken stock, a little bit of milk, some dried garlic, some marjoram, some salt and pepper, and then some butter. You bring everything to a boil on your saute function with your Instant Pot, and then once everything's boiling, you sprinkle your polenta cornmeal into it and stir as you're going so that you don't get any lumps. And I've seen people do cold start on this, where they just mix everything together in a cold Instant Pot and then cook it, or on a cold stove. And I haven't tried that yet, but that is also supposed to work. Lid goes on, and then you take it off of saute and put it onto regular pressure cook for 8 minutes, and then let it naturally pressure release for 15. And because this was a half batch, so only 2 cups of liquid, it was a little bit sticky on the bottom. I'm gonna stir in some nice Parmesan here at the end. And you can see it didn't burn, but there was a little bit of stickage just because the batch was so small. But absolutely delicious, beautiful polenta in all hands-off time, less than 25 minutes. Giving things a taste test here, just making sure that it doesn't need anything. Yum. And then I had taken a couple of small legs of lamb that we had and basically done kind of an osso buco style with them. And so we're having polenta with lamb this night. This refrigerates beautifully and it thickens up as it cools. So here's our beautiful lamb. That's a whole different video. And our delicious creamy polenta, and then our lovely wine vegetable stew going in there as well. This was a really lovely meal. By the way, Southerners will argue with you and Italians will argue with you, but polenta and grits are essentially the same thing. They're coarse ground Flint corn. All right, you guys, give polenta a try if it's something that you haven't loved in the past. It is well worth revisiting and a really fun homestead crop to grow. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.